What if I told you that my daughter's death, the one I never saw coming, was the event that opened my eyes to a truth I had never imagined? What if I said that her sacrifice, her search for love and truth, became the very key to my own salvation? The pain of losing her shattered everything I had ever believed. But it wasn't just her death. It was her life, her journey that led me to understand something far beyond the faith I had known. Through her, I found peace, a peace that transcended the lies I had lived by. This is the story of a mother's grief, a daughter's courage, and the revelation that the truth wasn't hidden in the way I had always been taught. It was far beyond the limits of my understanding, waiting to be discovered in the most unexpected of places. This is my truth, and I will share it with you. Before everything changed, my life followed a path that was set for me long before I had any say in it. I was born into a deeply traditional family in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, where every aspect of my existence was shaped by the culture and faith that surrounded me. My father was a well-respected man in the community, and he held his family to the highest standards of Islamic tradition. I was taught from the moment I could understand that my duty was to honor Allah and obey my father. Every decision in my life was made through the lens of our faith. What I wore, what I ate, who I spoke to, and even how I thought. There was no room for rebellion or questioning. The traditions were passed down from generation to generation, and my role as a daughter was to carry them forward. My life felt predetermined, and I was expected to be content with it. As a young girl, I grew up with the understanding that my father made the important decisions for me, and my role was to be obedient. The concept of marriage was not about love, but about duty and honor. I learned that women did not question the path set before them. They embraced it with grace and submission. When I turned 17, my father arranged for me to marry Sheikh Abdullah, a prominent figure in the Ministry of Islamic Affairs. I had never met him before our wedding night, but that was of little concern. It was an arrangement made to strengthen our family's position, and I was expected to fulfill my duty as a wife without hesitation. At the time, I didn't question it. I accepted that this was how things were done, and I told myself I would learn to love him in time. After all, that was what good Muslim women did: obey, submit, and in time, learn to love through patience and duty. My marriage became my life's new definition. My every move, every word, every gesture was a reflection of my husband's name. He was a respected figure in religious circles, and as his wife, I had a responsibility to uphold his reputation. I remember the first time I wore my abaya and niqab in public. It felt like a symbol of my new identity. No longer just my father's daughter, but a wife who belonged to her husband, to her faith, and to her community. I wore my abaya even inside our home when male relatives visited, and I rarely spoke in public. My duty was to serve my husband, maintain a well-kept home, and raise children who would be obedient to the Quran. My days were filled with domestic chores: cooking, cleaning, preparing meals for guests and imams who would come to visit. My world became entirely focused on my home, my husband, and the responsibilities assigned to me. I did not have any personal space. I had no friends outside of our household, no hobbies, no pursuits that were my own. My existence revolved around the traditions of our faith and the duties that came with being a wife of a respected man. My thoughts, my desires, my dreams. They were all secondary to the life I was expected to live. I had learned to keep my silence, to keep my opinions to myself, and to do what was expected of me. My life was confined to the four walls of our home, a world where every decision had already been made for me, where my role was clear, and where any deviation from the script was unthinkable. Despite the limitations, I found ways to convince myself that this was the life I was meant to live. I reminded myself that I was fulfilling my duty to Allah, to my husband, and to my family. I learned to suppress any longing for something more. My life was about serving others, my husband, my children, my community. and that was enough. I had no space for personal dreams or desires. I simply carried out my duties, knowing that each day was just like the one before it, and each day was part of the greater plan laid out for me. I believed that my submission was my strength, my obedience, my virtue. It was how I had been raised, how I had been taught, and how I had accepted the course of my life. But in the quiet moments, when I found myself alone, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. I had everything I was supposed to want: a respected husband, a well-maintained home, children to raise. But I couldn't escape the nagging sense that this life, though filled with duty, was lacking something deeper. The first real change in my life came with the birth of my daughter Illa. From the moment I held her, something shifted within me, a feeling I had never experienced before. Love. Not the kind of love that came from obligation or duty, but a deep, pure, and overwhelming sense of connection. The moment she was placed in my arms, my world transformed. For the first time, I felt like I had a reason beyond my responsibilities to live. The love I felt for her was unconditional, something raw and real. I sang to her when no one was around, whispering dreams and wishes that I had never dared to voice for myself. I spoke of a future where she could be anything she wanted, where she was free to laugh, to question, to explore. I wanted her to have everything I never allowed myself to have: freedom, curiosity, the courage to question the world around her. I wanted her to grow beyond the confines of the life I had lived, beyond the limits that had been set for me. As Illa grew, I saw signs of her developing a personality that was uniquely her own. She was different from the other girls in the family. While they were obedient and reserved, Illa was outspoken, intelligent, and strong-willed. She laughed loudly, unapologetically, and asked questions that I didn't have the answers to. She didn't accept things just because they were tradition. She questioned everything, and in her questioning, she made me see the world differently. Her curiosity was a spark of light in my otherwise dull world. I had spent my life obeying without question, but Illa was unafraid to challenge the norms. I watched her grow, proud of her strength, even as it made me uneasy. I realized that she wasn't going to be the daughter I had always imagined. She wasn't going to settle into the life of silence and submission that I had. Instead, she was going to forge her own path, one that would be shaped by her own decisions and beliefs. When Illa turned 16, the discussions about her future began. My husband, Sheikh Abdullah, was already planning her future in a way that reflected the strict traditions we had adhered to. He wanted her to study Islamic law at King Saud University, a prestigious choice for a young woman of our background. But Illa had other plans. She didn't want to follow the same path I had. She was drawn to literature, philosophy, and languages, subjects that would take her away from the world we knew and into one of new ideas and experiences. I supported her, but in secret. I couldn't voice my approval because it would have been seen as a betrayal of my husband's authority, of the path he had laid out for our daughter. But in my heart, I wanted more for Illa than the life we had built. I wanted her to have the freedom to think for herself, to explore the world beyond our conservative bubble. My own desires had always been stifled, but with Illa, I could feel the weight of those unspoken dreams being passed on to her. When the time came for her to leave, my heart was torn. Illa was going to New York City to attend Columbia University. I knew this was her chance to experience the world in a way I never could, to immerse herself in different cultures, ideas, and beliefs. It was a dream come true for her, but a difficult moment for me. I had spent my life under the shadow of tradition, of duty, and now my daughter was going to embrace a life of freedom I had never known. I kissed her goodbye at the airport, holding back my tears as she boarded the plane. I whispered a prayer for her safety, for her success, but deep down, there was something more I prayed for. Something I couldn't name but knew she needed to find. I prayed that she would discover truth, something that was uniquely her own, something that would give her the strength to live a life of fulfillment and purpose, beyond the confines of tradition and expectation. I prayed that she would find the freedom to become the person she was meant to be, without fear, without restriction. Watching her leave, I felt a sense of loss that I couldn't fully understand. It was more than just the absence of my daughter. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one where I no longer had control over the path she would take. And in that moment, I knew that Ila's journey was going to change everything. It was going to open doors to truths I had never considered, and I wasn't sure I was ready for what was coming next. While Ila was in New York, I began to receive her letters. At first, they were filled with excitement about her studies, her new life in a foreign city, and the freedom she felt. She described the coffee shops, the snowy winters, and the thrill of walking down the street, unmonitored and free. She spoke about her classes and the people she was meeting, her voice full of wonder. I was happy for her, but as the weeks went by, I began to notice a subtle shift in her words. Her letters started to change. She began mentioning ideas I had never expected from her: philosophy, peace, love. At first, I thought it was just part of being young and exploring new ideas, something that came with the freedom she was experiencing. But then, her letters took a different tone. She started speaking less about Allah and more about other concepts that seemed to push the boundaries of the life we had known. She wasn't just discussing her studies anymore. She was asking deeper questions, ones I didn't have answers to. She mentioned a Christian girl named Emily, someone she had met at the university. They had started talking about religion, about faith and beliefs outside of what we had always practiced. At first, I was shocked, but I tried to push the thoughts aside. I reminded myself that she was just learning, just expanding her horizons. It was normal for young people to explore, to question. But then she told me something that I could not ignore. She had visited a church in Manhattan. I felt my heart drop as I read the words. A church? My daughter, the girl I had raised in the strictest interpretation of Islam, had walked into a church? I could hardly believe it. My mind raced, my heart filled with panic. A church was a place of disbelief, a place where people worshipped idols, where people lived in sin. How could she have gone there? I felt a sense of betrayal, even though I knew she hadn't meant to hurt me. But I also felt confused. What was happening to her? What was she searching for? I tried to dismiss the thought, convincing myself that it was just youthful curiosity, a one-time exploration. But as the letters continued to come, I saw the changes in her. Ila began to mention Jesus. She spoke of him not as the Isa we had been taught about in the Quran, but as something more. She spoke of him as a man who loved, a man who forgave, a man who offered grace instead of judgment. She spoke of his words as if they were alive, as if they carried a truth that resonated in her heart. I was horrified. This was not the Isa I had known, the prophet of Islam. This was something different. The image Isla painted of Jesus was far removed from the teachings I had followed my entire life. She spoke of him as a figure who brought peace, who healed broken hearts, who didn't condemn but embraced. I couldn't understand it. My faith was based on a strict, unyielding understanding of who Allah was and what He required from us. This Jesus, this figure Ila was describing, was in stark contrast to everything I had been taught. At first, I tried to ignore it. I told myself that Ila was just going through a phase, that this was something she would eventually grow out of. But the more I read, the more I realized that this wasn't just a passing curiosity. Ila's search for truth had led her somewhere I couldn't follow. I had always believed that faith was something unchanging, that the truth was clear, that there was no room for doubt. But now, my own faith was being shaken by her words, by her questions, by her newfound understanding of the world. I didn't know how to respond to her. I couldn't share in her excitement, couldn't join her in her exploration of these new ideas. It scared me. I was afraid that if I accepted what she was finding, I would be turning my back on everything I had ever known. Yet, deep inside, I couldn't ignore the pull of her words. There was something powerful in what she was discovering, something that made my own faith feel incomplete. I had never questioned what I had been taught, but now, for the first time, I found myself questioning everything. Ila's letters became a lifeline for me, a source of both hope and fear. I was proud of her for seeking the truth, but I was terrified of what it might cost her. I didn't know how to help her, how to guide her back to the faith I knew, the faith that had defined my life. But at the same time, I felt a growing sense of fear that maybe the truth she was discovering was not something I could dismiss. I wanted to protect her, to keep her safe, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she was on a path I didn't fully understand, one that was leading her further away from the life I had carefully constructed for her. In the weeks that followed Ila's arrival back from New York, my unease grew deeper. I had been feeling a shift in her, but it wasn't until one night, when I received a call from her, that I began to realize just how much she had changed. She was crying. Her voice trembled with emotion, and I could hear the heaviness in every word. Ila shared with me a dream that had shaken her to the core. She described a man in white robes, standing in a beautiful garden, offering her peace. In that moment, she felt something I couldn't comprehend, an overwhelming sense of calm and love that stayed with her even after she woke. Tears stained her cheeks, she said, and the name Yeshua lingered in her heart when she opened her eyes. I was at a loss for words. I had never heard her speak like this. The dream sounded so foreign, so strange to me. It wasn't part of the world I knew, the world I had raised her in. Yeshua wasn't a name I had ever taught her. I knew the name of Isa, the prophet we had been taught about in the Quran. But this was something entirely different. I couldn't understand it, and the fear began to claw at my heart. But as much as I wanted to push the thought away, I couldn't ignore the pain in her voice. I couldn't dismiss the quiet truth that seemed to resonate beneath her words. Ila continued to share more about these dreams in the days and weeks that followed. She spoke of a man in glowing robes, one who exuded love, kindness, and peace, and each dream left her with a profound sense of comfort. Every time she told me about the visions, I felt a growing knot in my stomach. I had always thought that faith was something clear, something grounded in certainty. But this was different. This was something that felt deeply real to her. And yet it made me question everything I had ever believed. My daughter was no longer just questioning the teachings of Islam. She was living in a world that was unfamiliar to me, one where Jesus, not Isa, was central to her heart. And then, one evening, she confessed something that felt like a weight pressing down on my chest. Ila admitted that she had given her heart to Jesus. She had embraced a faith that wasn't ours, one that went against everything we had known. She had found something in Jesus, something she could not ignore, something that felt more real than anything she had ever encountered. She had prayed, not in Arabic as we had always been taught, but in English. Her prayer was simple yet powerful. She had called on Jesus not just as a prophet, but as Lord. She had accepted him as her Savior, and in doing so, she had stepped away from the faith we had both shared for so long. I felt the ground beneath me shift. My heart shattered in that moment. I couldn't bear the thought of losing her to another faith. Islam had been the core of our lives, the foundation that defined everything I knew. To think that Ayla, my daughter, had chosen a path that was so foreign to everything we had been taught was unbearable. I wanted to protect her, to bring her back to the faith that I'd spent my whole life following. But deep down, I knew that I couldn't force her. Her heart had already made its decision. It had found peace in Jesus, in a love that I could not deny her. I felt torn between love and fear. How could I support her decision when it felt like she was turning her back on everything we had known? And yet, how could I condemn her for choosing something that brought her peace? I couldn't understand it, but I couldn't deny it either. I had spent my life believing that Islam was the only path, the only truth. But Ela had found something beyond that, something that spoke to her in a way that my faith never had. My heart broke for the daughter I had raised in one world, but now she was living in a completely different one. I wanted to save her. I wanted to bring her back to what I knew, to make her understand the risks of leaving the faith that had defined our family for generations. But as I looked at her, I saw someone who had already made her choice, someone who had found something that filled her with a peace I could never have given her. The conflict inside me was unbearable. I couldn't force her to return, just as I couldn't let go of her. She had already walked down a path that I didn't understand, but I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. In the silence that followed her confession, I was filled with sorrow. The sorrow of losing my daughter to a faith I didn't believe in. But there was also something else, something deeper. As much as I wanted to fight against it, I could see the light in her eyes, the peace that she had found, and it terrified me, because deep down, I knew that Ela was no longer just my daughter. She had found something greater than the world we had known, and I wasn't sure if I could follow her there. The consequences of Ela's choice were swift and unforgiving, and they hit me harder than I could have imagined. When she returned to Riyadh, it was as if a quiet storm had taken root within her. She was still my daughter, the girl I had raised, but the changes in her were impossible to ignore. She wore her scarf, as expected, but there was a new light in her eyes, a kind of quiet defiance, a peace that both scared and confused me. It wasn't just the way she looked. It was the way she carried herself, the subtle shifts in her actions. She no longer attended prayers regularly, and when I asked her about it, she would respond vaguely. But it wasn't just the prayer. It was everything. She began to question everything we had taught her, everything I had believed was unshakable. She started talking about things I never thought I'd hear from her, and it became clear that she was no longer the Ela I had sent off to New York. One evening, she said it to me outright. She told me that she believed in Jesus. And in that moment, something inside me snapped. I felt a deep fear, an emotion that had been growing inside me for weeks, but now it had fully erupted. This was no longer a simple curiosity. She had chosen a path I couldn't understand, one that tore at the very fabric of everything I had ever believed. I felt my world crumble beneath me. This wasn't just a phase. This was real, and it felt like a betrayal, not just to me, but to everything I had ever known. I could not let this go. My daughter's belief in Jesus wasn't just a difference of opinion. It felt like a personal attack on our entire way of life, on the faith I had devoted myself to, on the very core of my existence. I knew I had to confront her. This wasn't something I could ignore any longer. She had to renounce this new faith, or there would be consequences. I didn't know what those consequences would be, but I knew that she couldn't continue on this path without paying a heavy price. I could see it in her eyes. She was no longer the child I had raised. She was someone else, someone who had found something I couldn't reach, and I didn't know if I could protect her from the storm that was coming. That night, I couldn't hold it in anymore. I told her father, Abdullah. He needed to know what had been happening. He needed to understand that Ela had changed, that she was no longer the obedient daughter we had raised her to be. When he found out, his reaction was explosive. His anger was like nothing I had ever seen before. It wasn't just disappointment or frustration. It was fury, raw and uncontained. He saw Ila's belief in Jesus not just as a rejection of our faith, but as a betrayal, an affront to everything he had worked for in his life. He couldn't fathom how his daughter, his flesh and blood, could turn her back on the faith of her ancestors, on the family name, on the position he had worked so hard to uphold. I could see his rage consuming him, and for the first time I felt powerless. This wasn't something we could talk through. He was beyond reasoning, beyond anything I could say. And in that moment, I realized how far apart Ila and I had become, how the chasm between our beliefs had widened. Abdullah's decision was swift and final. He locked Ila in the basement of our home, a cold, dark, windowless room that had always been used for storage. I could hear her cries from the other side of the door, and each one felt like a dagger in my chest. I couldn't stop him. I couldn't protect her from the consequences of her decision, no matter how much it tore me apart. The nights were the worst. I would lie in bed, unable to sleep, listening to the sounds of Ila's suffering. I knew what was happening down there, even if I couldn't see it. The beatings, the threats, the emotional torment. She was being tortured, mentally and physically. But she didn't break. I heard her whispering, praying in English, calling out to Jesus. She wouldn't renounce her belief, no matter how much her father tried to break her spirit. She was stronger than I had ever known, but I couldn't stop the pain she was enduring. I watched helplessly as my daughter endured something I couldn't stop. I was caught between two worlds, my love for her and my fear of the consequences of her choice. I felt like I was suffocating, trapped in a nightmare where the very thing I had taught her to value was now the thing that was tearing us apart. And yet, even as she suffered, Ila remained unwavering. She didn't apologize, didn't back down. I could hear her voice, calm and steady, even in the darkest of moments. She had made her choice, and in doing so, she had sealed our fates. I no longer knew what was right or wrong. My world had tilted, and I was powerless to stop the forces that had already set everything in motion. I had never imagined that my daughter's belief would cost her so much. But as I stood there, listening to her cries from behind the locked door, I knew that our lives would never be the same again. The day Ila died was the day everything changed. The shock and the devastation of her passing hit me like a tidal wave, dragging me under. She had been beaten, left to suffer alone in that cold, dark basement. When I finally found her, her body was still, her spirit gone. My heart shattered into pieces. In that moment, my world collapsed. The pain of losing my daughter was beyond anything I had ever imagined. But even in the deepest sorrow, something began to stir within me. It wasn't the end, not truly. After Ila's death, I found myself questioning everything. The faith that had been my life, the religion that had promised peace and salvation, had failed me. It had failed her. I had devoted myself to Islam for as long as I could remember, but in the end, it hadn't saved my daughter. It hadn't offered her the comfort or the peace I had been promised. She had suffered, and I had watched, helplessly. How could I continue to follow a path that had led us to this? How could I hold on to beliefs that hadn't protected the one person I loved more than anything? The question gnawed at me for days, weeks. I couldn't stop thinking about Ila, about her courage, her unshakable faith in something that wasn't what I had taught her. I realized that in her death, she had shown me the truth that had cost her everything. It was Jesus, the Jesus she had come to know, the man who offered peace, love, and grace, a Savior who had not condemned her but had given her hope. And in that moment, I knew. I knew that she had died for the truth, and it was that truth that I had to find. I started to pray, not to Allah as I had done my entire life, but to Jesus. It felt strange at first, foreign and uncomfortable. I had spent so many years calling on a God who seemed distant, unreachable, and now I was calling on someone I had once been taught to deny. But with every prayer, with every whispered plea for peace, I felt something change inside of me. I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. I didn't fully understand what it meant, and I didn't know what would come next. But I knew one thing for sure. I could never go back. I had seen the truth through Ila's eyes, and it had changed me. Leaving Riyadh was not an easy decision. My entire life, my identity, had been built around my family, my faith, my duty to my husband and our traditions. But now I felt like a stranger in my own home. I couldn't stay in the place that had brought me nothing but pain and loss. I had to leave, to find refuge, to escape the life that had trapped me for so long. I found a new place, a new beginning, far from the life I had known. And as I began to rebuild, I also began to share my story, the story of my daughter and the truth she had found. I began speaking out, telling others about Jesus and the peace I had found through him. I wasn't alone. There were others, like Illa, who had found a new way. Women who had walked away from the religion of their families, mothers who had lost children, people who were searching for the same peace I had found. Slowly, I began to realize that Ila's death had not been in vain. Her sacrifice had led me to a place I never thought I would be. Through her, I had found eternal life. I had found the love and grace that Jesus offers, and it was in that love that I found healing. I no longer had a family. I had lost my home, my status, my position in the world. I was an outsider, someone who no longer fit into the life I had once known. But in the emptiness that followed, I found something far greater. I found peace, I found grace, and I found a purpose. I had nothing left but the truth, and that truth was more than enough. It had given me a new life, a new heart, and a new direction. I knew that I could never go back to the way things were, that I could never be silent again. The world I had lived in was gone, and with it, my old self. But in its place, I had a new beginning. I would continue to speak the truth of Jesus no matter the cost, because I knew that there were others out there, just like Illa, who were waiting to find the same peace that I had found. I would not rest until the truth was known, until others could experience the freedom and grace that Jesus had given me. No matter how difficult, no matter the consequences, I would speak his name, because I knew that through his love, I had been saved. And that was a truth worth sharing.